With that, I want to welcome Anton. Anton, thank you for
Thanks very
taking the
much,
time.
Brian. I just
That's
want
all.
to point out, so what I'm going to do is jump into the presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this all works. This is my first time actually sharing anything on Zoom. I'm used to using Microsoft Teams. So if things go awry, Brian will let me know. Hopefully we're going to get into the slideshow presentation now.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, good show. So what you're seeing right now is actually I posted this thing on LinkedIn yesterday just because we did have a conversation at my office about the advantages and disadvantages of looking at outcrop and actually getting into the field, looking at rocks, as opposed to using really cool numerical simulations and statistics and all sorts of really slick computer programs that are starting to become popular, like analytics and whatnot. So of course, we have sinister Darth Vader telling poor Luke Skywalker that he finds his model, unacceptable. It's not what he wants to see. Luke is assuring him he's run analytics on it. And he's actually used Python, which everybody in their dog uses now. And Vader announces that, well, he's looked at the outcrop. And Luke finds this really, really hard to accept because, man, that can really ruin your day if you go out and check your statistical and mathematical models against a real world example. That really encompasses what I'm going to be talking about today. There's been a lot of work done on the Wilcox and the sourcing of the Wilcox in the first part of the Paleocene and the second part of the Paleocene into the Eocene. And what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today is why we're going to put a wrench into the story of the Paleocene routing of the Wilcox. It's not as straightforward as everyone's thought. It never is. Nothing's ever as straightforward as you think. But the talk is called No Ammonites, No Problem. And there's a reason for that. I'll talk to you about that in a second, but how are Paleocene trace fossils in Wyoming complicating, and I would say clarifying, sediment routing histories for the Wilcox? So with that, let's jump into it. I do have a bunch of people to thank, especially George Pemberton, who in 1998 identified a weird trace fossil I had found in some Paleocene rocks in the Hanna Basin. And he said, that's a Bergeria. I said, what is a Bergeria? And that got me started on my journey of looking at trace fossils for the next 20-something years. A bunch of other people have helped me, especially Glenn Sharman and Pete Flagg, and the three of us published a couple of papers on this a few years back. You can find them in Geology, some other references. And of course, my wife has put up with my travel and disappearing into the wilds of Wyoming for weeks and months on end. This is an advisory. You're going to see a lot of outcrops. I hope that's okay. There's not going to be a lot of numerical data, no core data, no well logs, just a lot of outcrop. There's a sheep because it's Wyoming. You've got to have that. So, jumping straight away into it. The Wilcox for a long time has been known, it's been known to have been sourced from the Western Interior and the bulk of North America. You can see in a variety of different publications the sort of estimated drainage basin area compared to the modern Mississippi drainage. And these are just some little basins that have been kind of sketched on top of North America to give you an idea of the scale and how it's really grown a lot over the past few years as people have looked at it further and further. From Winker in 1982, where it was kind of a smaller basin occupying about half the Mississippi drainage, to most recently Mike Bloom and Picha have looked at it in 2014, and they've expanded that basin almost into Canada. So we've expanded it all the way to the west, into Nevada, all of Wyoming. Wyoming's in the little red box, and we're going to be talking about southeastern Wyoming. That's the little red outline I have there. That's our focus for the evening. But you can see this basin has really dramatically increased in estimated size, and a lot of that's been based on detrital zircon work. The detrital zircons have changed the way a lot of geology is being done. It's a really powerful tool. You can get some really good data from detrital zircons, but there's also a tendency, and none of these guys have done it, I'm not saying they did, but I've actually spoken to some grad students whose thesis projects work around detrital zircons, and their tendency is to run up to an outcrop, knock a chunk of it off, run back to the lab, get a zircon data-derived date for it, call it good, and you're done. Without putting these rocks into context, without actually understanding what we're looking at, that's not the way to go. You can't just run up to an outcrop, knock a chunk off of it, run back to the lab, get a date, and call yourself good. So what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is what happens if we go into this little red this little red square in Wyoming and look at those rocks in the field. That little red square is very important because it is sort of at that little nexus of the smallest estimate of the basin, the mid-size estimate of the basin, and of course it includes the big estimate of the basin. In other words, all models of Wilcox sourcing acknowledge that that part of Wyoming is probably very significant for sourcing the Northern Rockies. roughly speaking, the Wilcox saw, and again, this is a swipe from Mike Bloom in 2014. He published this. This is his detrital zircon study. Everybody recognizes that in the early Cretaceous, the bulk of North America was sourcing up to the north. It was going through the Arctic Sea. It was going through the McMurray Sands, of course, the famous big incised valleys, the Athabasca Sands in Alberta. So there's these big incised valleys flowing to the north. Sometime in the late Cretaceous, of course, we had the Western Interior Seaway flooding North America. There was a big subsiding basin occupying all of Western North America. It divided the continent in two. Sometime after that, in the Paleocene, things changed. And it's about that time that sediment started sourcing down to the Wilcox and then also up to the north. The question is, and as these cartoons always show lots of question marks, how far was this basin extending? Did it actually include all of Wyoming like this? What happened to those fluvial systems in the Cretaceous that were initially flowing due west into a seaway that caused them to all of a sudden shift to the south and start sourcing the Wilcox? Did they all actually go to the south like this cartoon implies, or did some of them actually continue to the north? So this is sort of the going model. In the Paleocene, things shifted and everything went to the south. We're going to test that by looking at some rocks. First and foremost is looking at the volumes of sediment in the Wilcox to see, does it make sense that the basin would be that big? And part of the reason a lot of estimates of the basin have grown is because there's a huge volume of sediment coming into the Wilcox in the Paleocene. And it's about 60 million years, give or take 1 or 2 on each side, so about 62, 58, 59 million. There's a tremendous influx of clastics to the Wilcox. This is some work that Galloway had done in 2011. And it's the highest pre-Pleistocene sedimentary influx into the Gulf of Mexico. It's 3 times the average Cenozoic influx into the Gulf. So that's a really, really big volume of clastics dumping in. It's 2 orders of magnitude increasing above the earlier Paleocene, okay? And it's followed by a 10 times decrease during the Eocene. So something happened in the Paleocene. And the reconstruction that's been really popular is that, well, the entirety of the Western Interior Basin opened up and was unfetteredly draining into the Gulf of Mexico. That sounds reasonable, and if that was the case, we should go into the Western Interior, especially in that little part of Wyoming, and see big fluvial systems flowing throughout the Paleocene. This is from the paper that I mentioned before that Glenn Sharman and Pete Flagg and I published in Geology a couple of years ago. I've outlined Wyoming in red. There's our little AOI, the area of interest is the sub square in Wyoming. And it's very important because we're showing in this cartoon, we showed a major river drainage from the Green River Basin through what's called the Hanna Basin area. We'll talk about that in a second. But importantly, it also draws from Colorado, from Utah, and even as far back as Nevada, New Mexico, up into Montana and Idaho. We showed that as kind of draining into what has traditionally been called the Cannonball Sea in the early Paleocene. And we said, okay, so at this point, the Rockies were kind of draining into the Paleocene cannonball. Note the age, there's not a lot of sediment coming to the Wilcox at that point. Okay, so far so good. So what is coming to the Wilcox is a small area. We then suggested, okay, sometime in the late Paleocene, everything shifted and it all started heading south. And that accounts for this giant influx of sediment into the Wilcox. So again, there's our AOI, and we suggested that the river system, this big river system that existed, then abruptly started shifting to the south. So again, we're suggesting in 2017 that there was a major fluvial drainage through this basin. By the Eocene, it had stopped, and by the Eocene, the basin was largely either a lacustrine or a fluvial lacustrine system. Of course, the Green River Lakes were established. We had internal draining in the Western Interior, so that sourcing of all the sediment through the Green River Basin was not happening. We suggested probably is not happening in the Hanna Basin either. So again, we kind of had flow through of the Hanna Basin from the Green River until it shifted to internal draining. And sure enough, that's reflected in the Wilcox sediment. It's a nice, neat story. It makes a lot of sense, and it's consistent with what we saw. So what is happening, and when exactly did this shift occur from the early Paleocene, where the drainage basin outline and the drainage divide is established somewhere in the extreme southeastern Wyoming, to all of a sudden shift it to northern Wyoming in the late Paleocene? We're talking only 1 or 2 million years of time where the shift hypothetically happened. What happened there, and is this actual reorganization of a fluvial system that we call the California River, did this actually happen as we're depicting it? And in the last couple of years of going back out and checking the rocks, Summer break is a wonderful thing. You can actually drive up to Wyoming and take a look at the rocks and test these ideas. That's the beautiful thing about doing field work. You can test these ideas. A lot of this, by the way, is based on detrital zircons that Glenn and Pete and I collected. We went out, we did field work, measured sections, collected detrital zircons, and then tied the story together. But there were some things that just didn't make sense. So I kept going back and checking the outcome. Everybody's seen the Blakey maps. These are very popular. They're very convincing. They look real. It's got to be true. It's the standard kind of Cretaceous, late Cretaceous, Western Interior Sea, retreats by the latest Cretaceous and earliest Paleocene. It's completely gone except for this sad little vestige that maybe is in eastern Wyoming, maybe not. And the story goes that by the Paleocene, we're high and dry. Okay, so again, we're kind of ignoring the fact that there are marine deposits in the Dakotas, the Cannonball Formation, which has been well known for a century. It's not taken into account here. This feeds the narrative that we have continental drainage of the entire Western Interior and Appalachians into the Wilcox, but how realistic is it? What I'm going to try to convince you in the next, let's say, half hour or less, is that this is not actually what happened. I'm going to try to convince you there was actually a major seaway in the early Paleocene that persisted into southern Wyoming, possibly even further than that, 65 million. I'm going to try to convince you that, sure enough, in the late Paleocene, there was also a big Western Interior seaway that extended into Wyoming. This did not continue the entire time. What I'm being kind of sneaky about is I'm not showing you the gap at about 64 to 63 to 62, where it was high and dry for a while. But what I'm going to suggest is that there was these two major episodes of major transgression, probably from the Boreal Sea, the Arctic, into southern Wyoming. And we're going to look at the ground, we're going to look at the rocks in southern Wyoming and see, is this a reasonable hypothesis? If so, it's going to really change how we're looking at sourcing of rocks through Wyoming, through Montana, and into the Wilcox. Where we're going to go is we're going to go to a little basin in Wyoming, that small little red sub-basin, or the subset of Wyoming I showed you earlier. It's called the Hanna Basin. It's the deepest structural basin in the Rockies. This thing's really impressive. It's pretty much at the junction of laramide structures trending sort of east-west and north-south. If you go to the Colorado Front Range, they're all pretty much north-south. Here's the elbow. This is kind of the elbow of the laramide tectonics. And the basin itself is a deep little hole. It's like a little escalator that went almost straight down, starting in Cretaceous. We're going to look at a belt of outcrops that surround what's now Seminole Reservoir. It's along the Medicine Bow River and the Platte River. Really interesting area. The little town of Sinclair is down here. It's where the Sinclair oil refinery is. On a windy day, you can smell it for miles. It's really something. We're going to look at a subsidiary basin of the Hanna Basin called the Carbon Basin. This is separated by an anticline, a laramide anticline called Simpson Ridge. The Carbon Basin separated from the Hanna Basin sometime in the Paleocene. During the Cretaceous, they were contiguous. Sometime in the Paleocene, that little uplift started to bisect them and create a sub-basin. We're going to look at some outcrops in the Carbon Basin as well as the Hanna Basin in the Paleocene. Stratigraphically, this is a chart you're not going to see anywhere except for a publication that I have in review that's hopefully coming out soon. This is a brand new stratigraphy for South Central Wyoming. What it's showing is that in the Paleocene, we actually have a big marine tongue coming in the early part of the Paleocene, about 65 to 63 or 63 and a half. Possibly another one a little bit later. There's an unconformity like there is in most of the Western Interior in the Paleocene. Then there's that much later transgression of marine units at about 58 to 59. This is, by the way, the same age as the Waltman Shale member in the Wind River Basin just to the north, and we'll come back to that later. It's also the same age as the Cannonball Formation in North Dakota and Montana. I'm not sure if you all can see these two columns to the right. I just see my smiling face in a little window. If you can see what they are, though. Here's the stratigraphy of the Hanna Basin. Oh, I can move my window. Look at that. Okay, this is very helpful. I'm going to move myself off to the side so you can see this better. If you look at the stratigraphy of the Paleocene and the Hanna Basin, and I've measured it. This is actually part of my master's and my PhD thesis. So I spent many summers, about 20-something years ago, logging 5 kilometers of stratal section through the Paleocene. My fonts have changed a little bit here, I think, but what I want to draw your attention to is that this entire succession, if you read the bulk of the publications that have been churned out over the past century, describe the coals, the carbonaceous shales, the conglomerates and the sandstones, and interpret it as a fluvial to lacustrine to coal swamp environment. The coals are being mined, or until recently had been mined by the Arch Coal Company. It's no longer active, but there's a lot of Paleocene coals. There's a lot of sandy channels, so of course it must be fluvial. But I'll also draw your attention to these coastal onlap curves that I drew based on the occurrence of tidal facies and marine trace fossils. We're going to look at these. Importantly, the lower Wilcox into the middle Wilcox correlates, and especially that big first influx of the Wilcox correlates to an episode of major gravel and cobble progradation in the Hanna Basin and the Carbon Basin. It's also corresponding to an episode of, this actually shows tectonic activity of Simpson Ridge. So we have tectonic uplift separated basins at the same time that we have gravel and cobble progradation, at the same time that we have the Wilcox really starting to churn into activity. That's an interesting coincidence, and I'll show you why I think it's very significant. If you were to come out and look at the early Paleocene with me, maybe in a drone or a hot air balloon or something, we'd fly up into the southern part of the Hanna Basin here. We'd look at this belt of outcrops. Stratigraphic up is to the top, stratigraphic down is to the bottom. You can see the scale. It's many, many thousands of meters. The dip is about 10 to 15 degrees. So logging sections through this is a real ordeal. It's a very prairie-prone section. There's not a lot of cliffs except along the reservoir here. What these little triangles are showing is transgressive regressive cycles. And these are very easily recognized on the basis of coarsening upward successions like you'd expect in any shallow marine parasequence. There's an increase in sands and silts towards the top, and then you get a flooding surface. I'll show you in a little bit why we're calling these flooding surfaces and why I think they're actually genuine marine transgressive regressive cycles. Trust me, they are. The age dates come from a variety of sources. There's pollen, fossil mammals, and fossil leaves. These really help nail down those dates. The biostratigraphy out here is fortunately very, very good. After 63 million, there's a delta coastal plain succession with some fluvial channels. The takeaway that's very important, remember the story is, this is a major thoroughfare, a major fairway for clastics from the greater Green River Basin and throughout the rest of the Western Interior into the Wilcox, or at least up north before it swooped down to the Wilcox. Significantly, for at least 2 million years plus, there are no major sandy channels. It's a bunch of TR cycles. Okay, that's interesting. If you were to go a little bit closer and look at one of these TR cycles, here's a fluvial channel belt down to the lower right. That fluvial channel belt is sort of amorphous, but if you were to look at it closely, and we will in a couple of slides, you would see there's some trough crossbedding and ripples like you'd expect. There's also what I'm interpreting as tidal breaks. On top of that, we get these nice carbonaceous shales and silts and coals, which everybody has interpreted as fluvial plain or swamp deposits, or in some cases lacustrine. I'm going to argue they're actually not. They're probably lagoonal and bayfill deposits, and I'm going to argue that based on a variety of ichnofossils that we'll look at in a second, things like Bergeraea, Siphonicnus, Rhizocorallium, Ophiomorpha, Thalassonoides, all the things you'd expect in a nice lagoonal system. Higher up in the Paleocene, later on in the Paleocene, at about 58 to 60 million years ago, we're going to go up into the northeastern part of the Hanna Basin in this little red rectangle. Stratigraphic down is to the right, stratigraphic up is to the left. And again, the age dates here are very well established by a variety of fossil mammals, plants, and pollen. Really good resolution on all of those. And we can tell from that there's a big episode of cobble progradation. Look at those cobbles later on. These things are about the size of a loaf of bread all the way up to basketballs. They're really big cobbles. That's pre-60 million. Now remember the last one we dropped off at about 63. So this is sometime between 63 and 60. Then there's an episode of sort of finer grain material piling in that's mostly silts. There's some sand and some gravels. Then another episode of cobble progradation followed by more silt, sands, and gravels. Then we flood. And again, this is 58 million years based on plants and fossils. There's a big transgressive surface that you can follow for many, many miles around the basin, or kilometers if that's your inclination. But there's a big transgressive surface. And again, these little TR cycles that are very recognizable based on standard ichnology and facies relationships. So let's go a little bit closer and look at some of these. By the way, I should have mentioned my other key takeaway here. There's two episodes of major marine clastic progradation. Two episodes of major clastic progradation prior to the marine inundation. This is in the later Paleocene. So we have transgression early in the Paleocene, transgression later in the Paleocene, then these kind of weird episodes of big cobble progradation. So let's take a look at some of these sandy channels in the early Paleocene. This is what they look like on the ground. Most everybody has interpreted them as fluvial channels because they're sandy, they fine up, there's trough crossbedding, there's gravel, sounds like a fluvial channel. If you look at them in detail, you see scours in them. Those scours are overlain by accretion surfaces. You can actually see them kind of, I'm animating them up here. There's a paleobotanist for scale who's about 1.7 meters tall. So these guys are about 4 to 5 meters thick. If they're truly plain old fluvial channels, they should have fluvial facies in them, no argument. And one of the first things that started to look suspicious was back in about the 90s. When I was looking at these guys in detail, I started seeing features like this. There's bidirectional currents where you have larger bed forms with smaller bed forms superimposed going the opposite direction. There's bundles of organic draped and clay draped foresets arranged into what looks suspiciously like spring tidal bundles. There's more reverse lamination here, little ripples climbing back up larger dunes, again with the organic drapes, and we have indeed double mud drapes and double organic drapes. Overall, paleocurrents are to the east. That's kind of what we'd expect. Most fluvial systems are flowing to the east. You might have also noticed up here, I have this thing with a yellow arrow called abundant rhizocorallium. That comes in very importantly here because there have been arguments that these features, these sedimentary structures can be found in systems that are not tidal. In the 90s, it was very popular to call all kinds of heterogeneity in a sandy system tidal. If there's a mud drape, it's tidal influence. If there's a double mud drape of any kind, clearly tidal. If there's an organic drape, it's tidal. Since then, people have gotten a little bit more cautious, and it's always kind of questionable: is this stuff genuinely tidal or not? And that's why I say it was kind of controversial when it came out. But things like this little rhizocorallium note really, really shine a light on what we're looking at. So, what is rhizocorallium? That's a marine ichthyofossil, and what I'm showing here is some nice examples of rhizocorallium in the early Paleocene. Oops, I'm trying to rearrange myself so I'm not obstructing everything. That's fine. So rhizocorallium is a marine trace fossil typical of the Cruziana ichthyofacies. It shows up most abundantly down here in the early part of the Paleocene. But if you're not convinced, these photographs I have of rhizocorallium have actually gone in and traced them out for you. And these are typical kind of cartoons that people draw on top. There's the two tubes, there's the sprite between the tubes, and you can start looking a little bit closer on your screen and seeing the lower cartoon or the lower photograph. Here they are, in the photograph to the right, there they are. They're about the size of your finger, a little bit bigger. These are nice marine trace fossils. And here's Seminole Reservoir in the upper right. There's an SUV parked on top of a horizon of siltstone that is 100% churned by rhizocorallium. There's no sedimentary structures left in the siltstone. It's all burrowed by rhizos. Underneath it is a carbonaceous shale. Underneath that is a sandy estuarine channel with rhizocoralliums in it. So we have what I would argue, a sandy tidal estuarine channel overlain by transgressive interdistributary bay or lagoonal deposits, overlain by little bayhead deltas that are building out on top with silty caps and rhizocoralliums immediately under the next flooding surface. Incidentally, here's that paleocurrent diagram I showed you before from the fluvial channels where everything is flowing to the east. The rhizos, their apices, all face to the west and the southwest. There's been a lot of studies that indicate rhizocoralliums preferentially burrow towards the shoreline. So consistently, when you measure 120 of the apices of these traces like I did, it actually does bear out that hypothesis that these guys are orienting themselves towards the paleo shoreline if we have fluvial systems and estuarine systems building out roughly to the east and northeast. These guys are pretty much 180 degrees to the paleo shoreline. So that's an interesting aside. Here's another really great little trace fossil. This is Roselia. A lot of people know and love Roselia, and it occurs in the late Paleocene and the early Paleocene. It's made by these little guys called spaghetti worms, pterobelid polychaetes. But these guys are in a siltstone, and this is kind of a silty sand or sandy silt. Down here are some very fine sands. And what you can see with the rhizocoralliums is the characteristic fine-grained bulb with a little mud-lined stem underneath. And in that bulb, you have the onion peel effect. They stack on top of each other because this little guy was living down here, some sand built up and he had to readjust himself upward. They stack next to each other. These are really good marine ichthyofossils. By the way, rhizocorallium and Roselia, these things have never been reported in genuinely freshwater deposits. There is one species of Rhizocorallium jensens that does occur in freshwater. The ones we have are totally different species, Rhizocorallium commune. Roselia has never been reported in freshwater systems anywhere in the world, ancient or modern. This thing is a marine trace. They occur in distributary mouth bars. And why are we calling them distributary mouth bars? This photograph to the upper left shows very clear accretion sets heading to the west. That's counter to what I just told you about fluvial systems heading to the east. There's the accretion sets, but if we look at this model by Bo Tai and others that's been around for a while, you can actually see that mouth bars actually have a crest that does build upstream at the apex. So what we're seeing here is the upstream part of a distributary mouth bar. There's a lot of Bergeria. Bergeria, these are the things that George Pemberton first identified in '98 for me, and I've since found these guys all over the place. They're in the early and the late Paleocene, so that's the Ferris and the Hanna Formation. They are these little round, little circular blobs. This is on the bedding surface, the underside of the bedding surface. It's a natural cast. They can also be preserved as the natural cavities in ripple laminated sands. They're made by sea anemones. Again, Bergeria is an entirely marine ichnofossil. It's not freshwater, hasn't ever been reported in lacustrine or floodplain systems. These are marine guys living in the Paleocene in Wyoming. Ophiomorpha. Everybody and their dog knows Ophiomorpha. The one trace fossil most people can tell you about is Ophiomorpha. Here's a really nice one from the late Paleocene Hanna Formation. It's about 58 million years old in southern Wyoming. You can very clearly see the diagnostic little nodules on the outside of the Ophiomorpha, which, as everybody knows, is not fecal pellets like we were told in school by well-meaning professors. These are actually little nodules made by saliva and mucus by the shrimp, and it's ghost shrimp like this, Callianaceae ghost shrimp. If you come down to Texas, I can take you out to the Trinity Bay Head Delta and we can dig up modern Ophiomorpha. This is what they look like. You see those pelleted walls of the burrow. The burrow itself is actually very small, but the pellets line the outside of the wall, just like the specimens in the Paleocene. So there's no doubt these things are Ophiomorpha. Again, a marine animal. They can tolerate fresh water for weeks and months at a time, but they are ultimately marine animals living and breeding in marine systems. A lot of the facies in the Paleocene are very consistent with what we see again on the Trinity Bay Head Delta, the tidal flats. These are intertidal to subtidal flats on the mouth bars and delta front. This photograph in the upper middle part shows you a modern example of that. You'll see those big logs because every time there's a flood during a big storm, the wood from the surrounding floodplain gets swept down into the river channels and finds itself stranded on the Bay Head Delta. You see these characteristic combined flow ripples from the waves and the tides and the currents. You also see a lot of individual burrows, little vertical burrows by shrimps and bivalves and worms. If you go to the Paleocene, lo and behold, we have the same types of burrows, combined flow ripples, the same types of ripples, which are combined flows. We see the same types of burrows. We have things like Roselia and Siphonicus, which are made by worms and bivalves. We have Thalassinoides and Paleophycus and Ophiomorpha, made by shrimp. So just exactly the same fauna, the same sedimentary structures. Everything is the same in the Paleocene as what you expect in a modern, shallow, restricted brackish water deltaic system. We have logs, we got it all. For some context, what I did is I put together this figure. This has been shown in a few areas. It's going to be a few AAPG presentations. It'll be published soon. This is a cross-sectional view of some early Paleocene channels that have been interpreted as fluvial channels because they cut into each other and they're chock full of sand. We all know fluvial channels do that. These are the same channels I showed you that have Rhizocorallium and some Ophiomorphas in them, though. So we know they had brackish water in them. So we know they're not entirely fluvial. They actually did have marine or brackish water at the time of deposition. Scale-wise, they're, about maybe 200 meters wide, 150, 200 meters wide. The channel's kind of cutting into itself as it avulses. So just for a laugh, I went down and got onto Google Earth and looked at the Trinity distributary channel that's feeding the Trinity Bay Head Delta. This map on the lower right shows you, this is the Galveston Trinity Bay system. North is actually rotated because I'm trying to orient this roughly in the same direction that the Paleocene Hanna Formation and Ferris Formation channels would have been coming at. So it's kind of coming from the southwest to the northeast. So there's a Bayhead Delta here. Here's the brackish water restricted marine bay. Here's a tidal inlet, and here's the open Gulf of Mexico. I think the system that was creating the Ferris and the Hanna systems was probably very similar. So I looked at the distributary channel feeding these deltas, and lo and behold, they're about 80 meters to 150 meters to 200 meters. Take-home message, they're the same size. They're about the same depth, the same width. The trace fossil assemblages and facies are the same in the delta. Everything is a really, really good match for the Trinity Bayhead Delta and the Trinity system. Okay, so that's very interesting. What about getting clastics to the Wilcox? That's what we're talking about here. Here are some really interesting features. This is in the Carbon Basin. This is what's again been interpreted as a big fluvial channel system. But there's great biostratigraphy, and a fellow named Ross Secord did his work out here in the 90s. He and our grad students together, he's in Nebraska now doing professorial things. He looked at the mammals, and he found that there's big biostratigraphic gaps in these sandy channel deposits. Now look at the ages on these. We think this mudstone is about 63 million. We know this lower part of the channel is 62. And then we have a big gap of about 2 million years, and the stuff overlying it is 60 million. So within about less than a meter of incision, and we can see this thing cuts down about a meter and a half, you're missing 2 million years. There's a big gap. Now the Hanna Basin to the west preserves all that sediment. The Carbon Basin here doesn't have it. So somehow it's getting stripped out of the carbon, it's getting preserved in the Hanna, but that's also the exact same time that we have cobble progradation happening in the Hanna Formation in the Hanna Basin. Here's that 60 million years, here's that cobble progradation prior to 60. So that cobble progradation was happening to the west at the same time this erosional surface was happening. This is a bypass surface. So the cobbles that were getting trapped in the Hanna Basin were then bypassing the Carbon Basin and heading somewhere to the east. Okay, that's very, very interesting. There's also tidal deposits in those valleys, I should mention, in the early stages of the valley fill, so about 63, which is consistent with our previous paleogeographies. If you trace out the trends of these valley systems, they're roughly flowing northwest to southeast. And again, they have an age of about probably 63 to maybe about 60, something like that. So this is the Hanna Basin itself. This is a much thicker valley system. It's about 60 meters thick, amalgamated sand on sand on sand fluvial system. Stratigraphically on top of this, then we get back into some lacustrine fluvial systems and eventually that marine transgression. Okay, so here are the valleys that were actually sourcing the Wilcox. We found them. We know they're there. The previous valley I showed you was somewhere right about the B in Carbon Basin. So these valleys are flowing through the Hanna Basin into the Carbon. There was gravel progradation coming from the northern part of the Hanna Basin, spilling into the valleys and then getting transported out. That means that for the Wilcox, we only had a very small window of sourcing sediment through the Hanna Basin, because prior to this basin is transgressively flooded by marine sediment as well as lacustrine deposits. After the valley fills, it's filled with lacustrine and marine sediment. We only have a very small window of opportunity to pass sediment through the Hanna Basin. If it's happening at all, it's happening at this time between 62 and 60. If you want to look a little bit further to the north in the basin margin, like I was just telling you about, and you start walking around with me, we'd see stuff like this. These are the big cobbles. There's my thermos of water for scale. These are some of the cobbles. And if you look, they're actually in big sheets. They're not really in a fluvial channel at all. They're essentially big debris flows coming directly off the mountains to the north, the granite mountains. To the right, what you see is a series of really, really oxidized crayfish burrows. These are really heavily bioturbated silts. There's chock full of crayfish burrows. And Steve Hasiotis found these things in the early 90s and published them up with honey in, I think, 1995 out of the USGS. And these guys are all over the place. So you have an episode of really, really depressed groundwater. So we know the groundwater went really, really far down at about 60 to 62 million years. At about this time, so 60 to 62, there was this episode of gravel progradation, decreased groundwater after marine flooding, but prior to the next episode of marine flooding. So for the Wilcox, we only have this very, very small window of opportunity. Then immediately after that, whatever was sourcing the Wilcox in the later part of the Paleocene into the Eocene has to have been going somewhere around the Hanna Basin. It could have been coming through the basin because this is flooded, it's flooded. There's only this one little episode of bypass, and that has big implications for the regional paleogeography. This is a cartoon that shows everything I was just telling you about. I put it to to an animation. So it's showing you the time that's passing by from the earliest Paleocene through about the Eocene. So we're up in the lacustrine phase in the latest Paleocene there. Here's in the early Paleocene, you have the marine transgression, Bayhead deltas building, we have coal swamps behind that. It essentially is kind of transgressing, regressing throughout, and then it regresses. Then during the later Paleocene, it transgresses and then floods. So again, we only have a very small window of possibility of getting that clastic sediment. It's not here, it's not at 64, it's not at 63. It's probably going to be around 62, right there, 61, 60, and then it transgresses again. So the paleogeography of the Western Interior probably looked a lot more like this for a lot longer than we thought. For those of you that are familiar with Wyoming, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, you haven't talked at all about the Waltman Shale. What is it? How does that tie in? I think there's a really important story to be told with Waltman Shale, because the Waltman Shale, as you might know, is a big, mysterious body of subaqueous mud and silt that was originally described by Kiefer as a brackish water system. Then paleogeographies became very centered on showing a continental Western Interior in the Paleocene. So it was, well, Kiefer, he must be wrong. You can't possibly have brackish marine waters. It's got to be lacustrine. So the Waltman Shale is unique among lacustrine deposits in having glauconite and marginal marine algae that's never been seen before or after. I think with the recognition that we actually do have marine deposits in the Hanna Basin just to the south in the early and late Paleocene time equivalent to the Waltman Shale, I think there's a case to be made that the Waltman probably, well, it's not entirely marine, but probably a lot like Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela. It was probably lacustrine with periodic incursions of brackish marine waters in the Paleocene. So I think the Waltman would be an interesting body to look at again, with the knowledge that we do have these marine, undoubtedly marine trace fossils and sediments just to the south of it in the Hanna Basin. To me, that has really major implications for us in here. And just as a final thought, again, looking at this map, the very simple story is that in the Paleocene, we all of a sudden started draining all of North America, and all that sediment swept into the Wilcox. I'm not saying that's wrong. What I'm saying is this only existed for a very brief amount of time in the Paleocene. The Paleocene spanned 10 million years. We're looking at maybe 2 million years, maybe 3, where this actually could have happened. The remaining 6 to 7 to 8 million years, we had some degree of marine influence in Wyoming and possibly even further to the south. So what I'm going to say is that probably this was more typically the case, where you had these big arms of either the Cannonball Sea from the Arctic or the Boreal Sea, whatever you want to call it. It's even possible that extended further to the south. We don't really know. There's not been a lot of work done here, partly because the rocks aren't there. So you can draw all sorts of dots and make your own story for that. But I'm going to argue that this is probably more of a normal case for the Paleocene than what we're used to seeing, which is completely high and dry Western Interior. So the Wilcox story is a little bit more complicated. Hopefully it's a little bit clearer now. As a conclusion, this just says exactly what I just said. We had transgressions early and late in the Paleocene. The routing could only have happened for a very brief window of time, probably around 62 to 60, maybe 59, and then sometime after 57 in the Eocene, right? We've only been talking about the Paleocene, not the Eocene. Don't get me wrong on that. There was a major influx of the Wilcox sediment, and that was bounded by sea level rise. Was it eustatic? We don't know. It's Eustace has gone out of favor the past 20 years because nobody wants to talk about Eustace anymore. It's all relative sea level. The fact that this is such a regional change in the Western Interior, we see that same sea level rise in the Waltman, in the Hanna Basin, in a variety of basins that had very independent tectonic histories. To me, that thing is a much more regional driver than just the basin subsidence. Finally, the detrital zircons, they're very helpful. They give you a lot of great resolution. But the problem is to do the detailed paleogeography at the time steps needed. Like I was just showing you here, we really need to get back and look at rocks, especially the trace fossils. Every single section I just showed you was originally interpreted as completely continental, completely fluvial, or lacustrine. It's not until you start looking at the trace fossils, you start recognizing things that cannot and were not deposited and accumulating in continental basins. These are marginal marine to marine basins. So you really need to focus on the traces. They're not scary. They're not as cryptic as everyone thinks they are. Do yourself a favor and start looking at them. They're going to really open a whole new world when you're interpreting rocks. With that, I'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, so if you want to submit a question, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. You can go ahead and just click on that. It'll open up the Q&A module. and you should be able to type in a question there, and I can go ahead and read those off for Anton, or he can read them himself as well. So I just wanted to leave that open. I failed to mention that before the talk, actually, so my
Okay.
apologies.
That's fine. I'll stop sharing and eagerly look for them.
You haven't seen any questions come through.
No, I think
looks
either
like you've
everybody's
convinced
asleep or
everybody.
just left.
No, I think
This
you've
is
convinced
ridiculous. I
everybody.
don't know what I'm looking at. What's this guy talking about?
No, not at all.
There's a nice one.
You said you were going to convince everybody that that there was that whole transgression sequence that went through, and I think you did. We got one from I think that's Tom Tucker. So
Yeah.
so it would appear that the published sea level curves are not detailed enough.
Yeah, no, I would say that's exactly right. I think published sea level curves have a resolution that, again, we're talking at like millions to sub-million scale, right? So published sea level curves tend to take a lot of data from a lot of basins, kind of smear it out. So you get sort of a sense that things are operating at a scale of, 5 to 10 million years. But the problem is they're based on interpretation of stratigraphy, and the fact that nobody's interpreted the stratigraphy right in southern Wyoming means you're missing major transgressions in southern Wyoming. My suspicion is there's a lot of marine sediments out there that have been misinterpreted or underestimated in terms of relative saltiness because people haven't looked at the traces. A lot of sedimentologists and stratigraphers like looking at the rocks. They don't look at the ichnology. A lot of ichnologists only look at the traces, and where do they go to look for traces? If you're looking for marine traces, you go to the marine rocks. How do you know the marine rocks? Because they were published as such by a geologist. It's kind of circular, right? So not a lot of ichnologists go looking for marine traces in non-marine rocks, quote unquote, non-marine rocks. But I think the sea level curves that have been published, they're definitely due for an overhaul. I mean, we know sea levels responding to a lot of things. And of course, in the 80s, 90s, it was used to sea. Then by the 90s, 2000s, it was relative sea level and tectonics. Ron Steele at UT Austin has been doing some interesting work with the students, coming up with ideas of sea level changing minus glaciers. So I encourage anybody to talk to him and his students. They have some really interesting ideas about that. But I think, in supposed hothouse systems like the Paleocene, Eocene, and Cretaceous, I think we've really underestimated the frequency of sea level changes and the distribution. So yeah, I 100% agree.
Well, we've gotten some other comments in the chat about how great of a talk it was. So it seems like you hit this one out of the park.
Yeah, I like those.
Everybody agrees with you. No questions.
Perfect. That's the best. It's such an open and closed case. You can't even argue.
We're all smarter.
You can't argue with rocks.
Well, I would say that Anton has agreed to have this recorded, and we will be publishing it in YouTube a month after today. We got another question though. So
yeah, there's a question. How well do we think we've correlated the Cretaceous stratigraphy of the Western Interior? I'm going to argue, based on my experience, and at ConocoPhillips, we've been doing a lot of work in the Western Interior over the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years. I've worked with some really good biostratigraphers and sedimentologists. I'm going to say there's always room for improvement. I think there's been a lot of lithostratigraphy, and a lot of lithostratigraphy has driven how things are correlated. I think, fortunately, we're getting past lithostratigraphy. A lot of people are, and a lot of looking at the chemostratigraphic signatures and a lot of the biostratigraphic signatures of these rocks is getting us beyond lithostrat. I think that's going to be real key, because I think a lot of the correlations that we hold near and dear are probably not right. And I think calling something, the frontier formation in basin A, B, and C because they look alike, and then you correlate the frontier and say, look, it's a giant sheet. Do you actually know it's the same formation, or is it the same facies in different chronostratigraphic intervals? Certainly in the Paleocene, if I didn't know I was in different chronostratigraphic zones in the Ferris and the Hanna formation, there's a lot of faulting out there. I might actually think I'm seeing the same rock section over and over. And some people have argued that's what you're seeing, but the biostrat doesn't lie. It tells you you've got different sections. The same exact type of environments leave the exact same remnant, so of course they're going to look alike. So I think the correlation in the Cretaceous Western Interior leaves a lot to be desired depending on where you are, what basin, and even within the same basin. we've got to stop doing lithostrat. You know, it's terrifying to see how people glom onto, oh, that's the A sandstone. You can take that all the way around the basin. You go, can you really? Have you really tried that? I don't know. I'm not sure. So yeah, that's my personal take on it anyway.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending and submitting the questions. We really appreciate y'all's participation. I also wanted to take this chance again to thank Task Frontera Geoscience for agreeing to sponsor Anton's talk. And I want to thank Anton again for taking the time out of his busy schedule to give this talk and grace us with a fun journey at the outcrop digitally. So thank you so much, Anton.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity. It was really great fun, and I really enjoyed this. So yeah, hopefully you guys got something out of this, and thanks for the opportunity.
Not at all. Well,
Be safe
with
out there.
that, will do. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and close up the event. Stay tuned on social media. Check out the HGS website, or if you're on the email blast for upcoming events, we will be continuing to host more of these. So thank you so much, Anton. We'll talk later, man.